y dejo a Simon con ustedes. Okay, so Simon, thank you very much for being here. Welcome to this webinar. Everybody knows that this is going to be in English, so just feel free to go over. We are going to concentrate all the inquiries and questions that people are going to pose throughout the webinar, and we're going to let you know, so this will be very interactive. Welcome, okay. Simon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Felipe. Thank you, and welcome, everybody. Please, if you have any questions for clarification of what I've just said, just shout out. I'm happy to answer questions as we go through. So my background is I'm originally from England, and what we know about England in the news is that we beat Germany 2-0 at soccer yesterday. And having spent time in Bogota during the World Cup and during Copa America, and as the proud owner of Colombian national shirts, I understand we share that passion in our heart for soccer. But today we're going to talk about psychopaths. And let me share my screen with you. A very unusual topic for a supply chain professor. And my background is that I originally started work in the auto industry, in supply chain, in purchasing. Had my own businesses for 10, 12 years, and have been an academic for 30 years, always in supply chain management. But I became interested in people. I think we're all interested in people, but I became very interested in people in supply chains. And long story short, in 2014, I started a new research stream working with Katharina Fritzen and Nathan Brooks, who are psychologists. And I completed a master's degree in psychology as well. So I'm now a psychologist as well as a supply chain professor. And the topic of today's presentation is something called corporate psychopathy. And I'll explain something about that as we go through, obviously. But I wanted to start off with a short video. It's a TED talk by Professor Dan Ariely, which kind of sets up why I think people are interesting. And I frequently say that in supply chains, people do business with people. It's about relationships, and people do great business with people they like. But I'm looking at the other side of that. I'm looking at the challenges that we have. So let's look at an interesting, if slightly light-hearted perspective.
I'll give you a couple of more examples of irrational decision-making.
Sorry, I don't know why.
I'll give you a couple of more examples of irrational decision-making. Imagine I give you a choice. Do you want to go for a weekend to Rome, all expenses paid, hotel, transportation, food, breakfast, a continental breakfast, everything, or a weekend in Paris? Now, weekend in Paris, weekend in Rome, these are different things. They have different food, different culture, different art. Now, imagine I added a choice to the set that nobody wanted. Imagine I said a weekend in Rome, a weekend in Paris, or having your car stolen. Now, it's a funny idea, because why would having your car stolen in this set influence anything? But what if the option to have your car stolen was not exactly like this? What if it was a trip to Rome, all expenses paid, transportation, breakfast, but doesn't include coffee in the morning? If you want coffee, you have to pay for it yourself. It's €2.50. Now, in some ways, given that you can have Rome with coffee, why would you possibly want Rome without coffee? It's like having your car stolen. It's an inferior option. But guess what happened? The moment you add Rome without coffee, Rome with coffee become more popular, and people choose it. The fact that you have Rome without coffee makes Rome with coffee look superior, and not just to Rome without coffee, even superior to Paris. Here are two examples of this principle. This was an ad from The Economist a few years ago that gave us three choices: an online subscription for $59, a print subscription for 125, or you could get both for 125. Now, I looked at this and I called up the economist and I tried to figure out what were they thinking. And they passed me from one person to another, until eventually I got to a person who was in charge of the website, and I called them up and they went to check what was going on, and the next thing I know, the ad is gone and no explanation. So I decided to do the experiment that I would have loved the economist to do with me. I took this and I gave it to 100 MIT students. I said, what would you choose? And these are the market share. Most people wanted the combo deal. Thankfully, nobody wanted the dominated options. It means our students can read. But now, if you have an option that nobody wants, you would take it off, right? So I printed another version of this when I eliminated the middle option, and I gave it to another 100 students. Here's what happens. Now the most popular option became the least popular, and the least popular became the most popular. What was happening is that option that was useless in the middle was useless in the sense that nobody wanted it. But it wasn't useless in the sense that it helped people figure out what they wanted. In fact, relative to the option in the middle, which was get only the print for 125, the print and web for 125 looked like a fantastic deal. And as a consequence...
So it's intriguing that humans do not take rational decisions. Dan Ariely has written a number of books and articles all around predictable irrationality. So I found this intriguing because a lot of the underlying theory in supply chain management assumes that managers, individuals in supply chains, act rationally or act boundedly rationally. In other words, given the information they've got, people will always take a rational decision, the logical decision, an optimal decision. We know that's not true because supply chains get disrupted. We also know it's not true because, having spent all of my career in supply chain, it's very clear that a lot of the decisions that are taken are really problematic. Sorry. And so I was curious about the logic of the assumptions in supply chain theory, probably since I was a doctoral student. But about 15 years ago, when I first joined the University of San Diego, I started to hear from our students in the Masters in Supply Chain Management about the problems they had with their boss, their senior executives, their project sponsors, people in positions of influence. And essentially what was happening is that these students were having real problems, that they were not getting supported by their boss. They would deliver great projects and then the boss would take credit. And I saw that so many times that it struck me as not just the wrong thing to do as a manager, but something that's inappropriate. It's bad behavior. It's unethical. And so talking to one of my dear friends, he said to me, you should read about the dark triad of psychopathy, narcissism, and Machiavellianism. And that was it. That's why I started studying extreme personality traits. I then wanted to understand something about the problems in supply chain of toxic individuals. And the reason I'm at Uni Andes last week and this week is to teach a sustainable supply chain course. And in conducting research into sustainability, often come across companies where it's really difficult to advance a sustainable agenda because of senior executives, CEOs, and so forth. In the literature, there's very little research about toxic individuals. This is a comment from 2007. I've just had a paper accepted last week that should be published in September, where we find very little research into toxic individuals in supply chains, and it causes a problem for our understanding, our academic understanding of supply chains. But more importantly, it causes a problem because how do you advance environmental changes? How do you stimulate innovation? How do you really improve cooperation in supply chains if you've got individuals who have problematic personalities? And I particularly became interested in psychopathy. So let's take another video clip. This time it's from a crime drama. So it's not real life, it's fiction. These are actors. But the guy who's being interviewed by the two police officers explains how he thinks as a psychopath.
What I'm baffled by is how I'm able to perform such appalling acts in the first place.
Do you feel any guilt for what you've done?
Do I feel any? No. On an intellectual level, I understand the pain I've caused. But on an emotional level, no, I feel nothing.
Do you think you're capable of feelings?
For my children, yes, there's definitely something there. And I feel anger on occasion, but apart from that, probably not.
So no feelings for your patients or your friends?
If I never saw any of my friends again, it wouldn't bother me in the slightest.
That's not exhausting, all that pretense.
I've done it my whole life, so to me, pretending is just second nature. All of which, as I'm sure you'll know, suggests I'm pretty much a textbook psychopath. Above average intelligence, superficially charming, zero empathy. But how did that happen? Well, then we're down to the old nature versus nurture debate.
So a short but very accurate insight into psychopathic personality disorder, and we'll simply talk more about that. But psychologists define psychopathy firstly as not one condition, but people who score very highly for psychopathy can be very different. You know, it's not just serial killers. It's not people who are antisocial. There are many individuals who kind of score highly clinically in psychopathy. And so the four aspects that are really intriguing are: one, but from an interpersonal perspective, psychopaths often seem very charming, very charismatic, but they have this amazing self-belief that they are important. Compulsive liars and extremely manipulative. So that's facet one, this interpersonal aspect. Facet two is called the affective dimension. So this is the extent to which you feel for other people's suffering or pain or joy or hope. So psychopaths show no guilt or remorse. They have very shallow emotions, almost completely lacking emotionally, no empathy, and never take the blame. Never take the blame for anything that goes wrong. You know, I didn't lose. It was a corrupt election. You know, President Trump's statements continue to this date. He, by the way, has been classified as a psychopath by a number of psychologists. I had an article in Fortune magazine 2 weeks ago in which the editors decided to introduce the article by discussing that aspect of President Trump. Facet three is about lifestyle. You know, very parasitic. So often will exploit others financially and emotionally, very irresponsible, easily bored, so always looking for stimulation. And then the fourth facet, which we normally associate with criminals, is the antisocial, very early behavioral problems, lots of criminality, lots of marriages, very promiscuous sexually. The key point to make is that psychopathy is a constellation, it's a spectrum. So some people may score very highly on facets 1 and 2, but not so much on facets 3 and 4. Other people may score very highly on facet 4, but not on facet 2. So we have to accept that not all psychopaths are the same. One of the leading exponents of and academics in the field of psychopathy is Professor Robert Hare. And here I am delighted to meet a really charming guy, actually, 3 years ago at a conference on psychopathy. And he said, think of psychopaths as predators, because their whole reason for existing is to exploit the system, exploit others, gain power, gain benefits for themselves. Sometimes it's as simple as just not complying with norms in society or norms in business, not for personal gain, but just because their ego gets in the way and they lack in conscience. And Robert Hare has been researching this field for, well, he's 82 at the moment. He's been researching this field for most of his career, so for 40, 50 years. And I'm not going to get into this in a lot of detail, but essentially what we have here is the 4 dimensions of psychopathy. And the statistical model shows the sort of relationship that you find between scoring high on lack of interpersonal capabilities and lack of affective capabilities. But the point I want you to take away from this is that people who score high on psychopathy can be very different from each other. Some can be very antisocial, some can be extremely sociable, extremely successful in business, but their whole reason for being is for themselves to confront the system, so to speak. And you may or may not be aware of the big 5-factor model of personality. Essentially, the beauty of this model is that taking these 5 dimensions enables us to at least describe individuals' personality. We only need 5 factors, and that's why they're called the big 5. How open we are to experience, people who are willing to seek new opportunities versus people who are very conservative, who don't like change. Conscientiousness, people who are really hardworking versus people who are not. Extrovert or introvert. How agreeable somebody is. We all know people who we really like and are easy to get along with. We also, I'm sure, know some people who are very difficult to get along with, who are not sociable. And then neuroticism or emotional stability, how calm or how emotional somebody is. We all know somebody who's very emotional. We all know somebody who's very calm. I joke with my wife that sometimes she fears the worst for our adult children. If they go out on a vacation for 3 days, she'll be worrying about what's going to happen. And I'll say, well, look, they're 28, 31 years old. They're responsible, etc. Because I can't help it. That's just who I am. And likewise, I, for whatever reason, tend to be a little more calm in those situations. So that's an example of slight differences, subtle differences in that dimension. There's a belief that our personality stays relatively stable, but recent research published last year actually shows that we can change our personality. We can change the extent to which we get stressed, and we can change the extent to which we become conscientious. And I certainly see this in myself. When I think about my conscientiousness to complete projects, to work on my writing, to work on new ventures compared to 20 years ago. That has changed in me for whatever reason. Often it's to do with age, that we tend to not be as distracted as much as we might be when we're younger. So we do know that personality is relatively stable, but it can change. There is a strong relationship between personality traits and psychopathy. So psychopaths tend to not be very open, not be very agreeable, and not be very conscientious, but they give the appearance that they are. They also tend to be rather neurotic. In other words, very easy to become angry. And one of the earliest books on psychopathy was by a guy called Cleckley. And he said, more often than not, a typical psychopath will seem particularly agreeable. They'll seem very nice and make a distinctly positive impression when first encountered. And bearing in mind that we as humans tend to rely on our first impressions. When we first meet somebody, we think that they're normal, they're pleasant, they may be extremely competent, and it's very difficult for us to shake that initial impression. And this is why psychopaths are such good predators, because innately they understand that if they make you like them very early on in your relationship, it's very difficult for you to then start disliking them. You need a lot of evidence to change your mind. It's called confirmation bias. We tend to look for evidence that supports our view. It applies in all aspects of our belief systems, but it particularly applies when we're thinking about individuals. I meet somebody, I like them when I first know them. It takes me a long time and sometimes extremely egregious, extremely severe behavior before you think, actually, this person is not a good person. And I've had 3 examples in my life of people like that. And it took me many years to discover, realize, and recognize. One individual was a former student from 25 years ago, who I had a lot of respect for in his ability to support all of the strategies that we were implementing as an academic research center. But over 5 years, gradually it was clear that A, he couldn't undertake high-level academic work, and B, that there was some fraudulent practices. And in fact, it transpired that he'd been committing fraud for a long time. But nobody believed it because the guy was so nice. And there's a reason for that. Psychopaths are predators. They have a very instrumental, a very purposeful approach to their relationships with other people. Nothing is by accident. So a psychopath will very quickly in an organization determine what role you or I play in their life. Are you going to be a partisan? Are you somebody who's going to like them and will be a supporter? Wear the t-shirt with my face on it. Are you going to be a patron? Are you going to be somebody who helps my career or provides money? Not necessarily because you like me, but because you see that your interests are served by me. Are you a police person? A police officer? Not literally, but in an organization, somebody who runs the audit process, or somebody who has access to your financial budgets and your expenditure could be the person. So you make sure, in the same way as if you're driving and you see a police car, you slow down, or at least we do in California. If you see the police, you behave differently. Are you going to be a pawn? Many of my students, when I first got interested in this issue, they were clearly being used to do all of the hard work. And then the boss would take the credit. Or are you going to be a patsy? Are you actually going to be the person who, for example, if a psychopath is committing fraud, they'll leave a trail which points to somebody else, and that's called the patsy. And so psychopaths are not like us. Psychopaths are very political with a small p. They look at, how do I use people to achieve my goals? So let's dig a little bit more deeply into the dimensions of psychopathy before I talk about the research that we've carried out. I think most of us understand what narcissism is. Narcissism is when we have this feeling of self-importance. We have this preoccupation with fantasies of success. We believe we're successful, we're unique, we're entitled, we don't care about others, we're arrogant, we need to be told we're great all the time. So that's an example of narcissism. And there is a view that social media has increased our awareness of narcissism, because it's a great opportunity for people to get into the public domain. Machiavellianism, there is a drama series called The House of Cards, which is about a politician who achieves success by using others, by spreading disinformation, by telling one person part of a story. You know, oh, John has been doing a lot of work in the background to try and raise funds to stand for this political post. And then you say to John, oh, did you know that Diane is trying to raise money to stand for the same political post? So using other people by spreading lies. And psychopathy has a big implication for organizations. It can lead to a lot of fraud, a lot of failure, a lack of corporate social responsibility. And this is the area I'm most interested in at the moment. I mean, what we see is that high degrees of corporate psychopathy here are linked to very low corporate social responsibility. This is a very interesting study, showed that the less psychopathy in an organization, the higher their social responsibility. The higher the degree of psychopathy in an organization, the greater the amount of bullying at work. So these are two studies that have been published that have found that when you have high evidence of psychopathy in an organization, it has negative implications. Robert Hare has said that, you know, if we fail to identify the existence of psychopaths, we're doomed to be their victims. Now, often in my presentations, people put their hand up and go, let me tell you about, and it'll be about a relative, a friend, a boss. And they'll describe somebody who sounds psychopathic. And the question is, well, what do I do about it? In a nutshell, it's very unwise to confront a psychopath directly. It may be better just to avoid them. But the one strategy that is good to think about is, you know, we know that sharks are a predatory animal in the ocean, and yet very rarely do they attack and kill dolphins. And the reason for that is that dolphins operate collectively. So the one piece of advice I can give anybody who's working in an organization where you're pretty clear that you've got somebody who's toxic is make sure other people have the same view. Make sure that you're not the only one who's trying to address this individual. The question now is, are there many corporate psychopaths? So one of the first studies by Robert Hare used this instrument called the psychopathic checklist. and the R stands for revised. It's a revised version. They studied 203 individuals. Basically, anybody who scores 30 and above is considered to be psychopathic. Most people scored 0, 1, 2, or 3. So most people have no incidence of psychopathy. He found about 1 to 2%.
Simon,
sorry, yes.
Sorry, so interesting. I'm here just tripping on this information, especially because the context of the webinar is supply chain. So this for me, it's amazing how from such an interesting context of psychology, we are going to arrive to this universe of corporates. But I have a question.
Yes.
At the moment, we don't have questions in the chat, but I do have a small question, which is, how do you get this information that people would, what type of methodology do you use to map potential in corporations?
Yeah. Okay. I'll talk about that in each stage of the process. In this study, the psychopathic checklist is really clinical interviews and clinical observations. One of the authors, Paul Babiak, is an organizational psychologist and a consultant, and he interviewed 203 people. He had access to their personnel records. He conducted not so much a survey, but he carried out an analytical instrument. Common in psychology, actually, you often interview people and ask a series of structured questions. So they used a very robust method that is regarded as kind of like the gold standard for assessing psychopathy. It was just fortunate that his sample base was 203 managers and executives. And so the scoring methodology has been validated. If you dig into the psychology literature, the psychopathic checklist is regarded as a robust instrument for measuring psychopathy. I'm going to talk about another instrument in a minute as well. But it's a great question. How do you find this out? It's not a simple case of just observing somebody. It's often a case of going through quite a robust assessment in the same way as you would do a medical assessment, a physical assessment. Does that answer your question?
Yes, definitely. Thank you.
Okay. And what they also found in their assessment was that people who scored relatively highly on the psychopathic checklist tended to be very effective at communications, very creative, and a good strategic mindset. And in fact, there's an increasing body of work talking about successful psychopaths that finds that often in the field of the arts or creativity, those really amazing artists, those amazingly creative individuals, they tend to score quite highly on psychopathy. They're not necessarily antisocial, but they're extremely focused. They kind of care about nothing else and nobody else but their work and their art. Steve Jobs scores highly for psychopathy. Keith Richards from the Rolling Stones, Richie Blackmore from Deep Purple. I'm a bit of a heavy rock fan, so I'm quite aware that there are personalities in music who really have, they're quite difficult people to deal with, but they just create some of the best regarded music. On the downside, kind of to this point, is that people who score highly on psychopathy are terrible managers, terrible team players, terrible leaders, because they don't understand that you need to have people on your side. What they believe is that you dictate to people. So Steve Jobs, for example, used to burst into tears if he didn't get his own way. He used to shout. He would fire people on the spot. So there's a strong correlation between psychopathy and creativity, and a strong negative correlation between leadership skills, team playing, and psychopathy. And you often find a correlation between psychopathy and intelligence, but this is only in psychiatric patients. So psychopathy in organizations, I want to get into the supply chain study that we did. Most of the research up until 2004, 2005 was dealing with prisoners and patients. But it had been recognized that not all psychopaths are in prison. They're often in the boardroom. The statistic to note and think about, because I'm going to come back to this, is about 1% of the general population and 3.5% of senior management score above the cutoff for psychopathy. In prisons and in mental institutes, it's anywhere between 15 and 25%. And there's some great examples of successful psychopaths. And Diana's asked, how can we build relationship with these people? The first thing is to be aware of the existence of psychopathy and what that means. The second is to be alert to the condition. And the third is, I always recommend keeping a journal, making sure that you're keeping records of your interaction, your experience, the behavior of individuals, so that you're not second guessing yourself, you're not doubting. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later in this session.
Simon,
so, yeah.
I am just going to quickly interrupt you because we have a question here from Diana. She's one of our guests. She's asking the following. Simon, how do you think we can build relationship with these people, understanding their condition, and as such that we can move forward in the development of a supply chain?
Yeah, I mean, that was the point I was making about firstly being aware that not everybody's like you. There are people who are psychopathic. Secondly, making sure that you're not being brought into their pattern of behavior. And thirdly, documenting, keeping a journal. I mean, it's the advice I give whenever I'm asked this question: what can I do to work with somebody like this? Well, keep track, keep a record. And certainly over the last 5 or 6 years that I've been talking about this to various audiences, I've had a number of people who've come back to me sometime later and say, you know, now I look back at this journal of this individual's behavior and my interaction with them, it's clear that they're extremely toxic individuals. More importantly, this journal has been good evidence or data for me to think about how I interact with them. I think a final point to make is that not all psychopaths are serial killers or necessarily out to commit harm. Quite often, very successful individuals, first responders, surgeons, special forces, people in stressful jobs, they need to actually have something in their personality that enables them to detach. And I read a great book by a researcher in psychopathy who realized that he was psychopathic. And he said, you know, once I mentioned this to my friends, family, and colleagues, they all said, yeah, you can be very intolerant of others. You can be really difficult to work with, but you're driven, and it's the fact that you're driven. So not all psychopaths are going to be negative in everything that they do. You just have to be mindful of their existence. And let me give some examples of where this manifests itself. So my colleague Kate Fritzen was, the reason I worked with her is she was one of the first people to publish a study of managers with psychopathy. And with Belinda Board in the UK, they studied 4 different samples: business managers, psychiatric patients, mental institute patients, and prison psychiatric department patients. They found that business managers scored more highly for histrionic personality disorder, this superficial charm, this egocentricity, than the other 3 samples. They found that business managers were as narcissistic. They had this grandiosity, this lack of empathy. compared to prisoners and psychiatric patients. And they found that managers were equally compulsive. In other words, this obsessive perfectionism, devotion to work, working 12-hour days, expecting other people to work 12-hour days. So let's get into the supply chain side of it. Why do we care? Why is procurement important? Well, my background is in procurement, and that's the area that I've published and researched and worked in most. And I just found this graph. It's a bit out of date, but it underlines something that I see. Increasingly, organizations are outsourcing. Therefore, we're spending more money with suppliers. So it's where the money is. Second thing to take into account, fraud is very common in business, and it exists because people have an opportunity, they are motivated, and they can rationalize it. So if I'm a psychopath, stealing money is helping me. So that's my rationalization. I might need money because I've got an addiction, and I might have easy access. Well, guess what? 3 studies I've seen now, PricewaterhouseCoopers, Deloitte, and I think A.T. Kearney or Accenture, found that procurement is one of the most common places to find fraud, either because we choose suppliers who give us a bribe, we choose suppliers who are related to us, we invent suppliers, and so it's a clear fraud that we divert money to places where it shouldn't go. So to me, because I'd worked in procurement, 2 things struck me as raising this question of, is psychopathy common in procurement? 1, it's where all the money is, and there's a lot of fraud taking place. 2, I've worked with buyers, and they have a strong ego. They have a lot of power by virtue of controlling millions of dollars of expenditure. So what I wanted to do, sorry, I'll click through too many slides. I looked at the literature in procurement and concluded that a lot of our assumptions are that people, by and large, act under certain rules, and there's no discussion of personality. Yet the early studies of personality disorder found higher incidence of psychopathy in corporate executives than in the general population. So I wanted to check that. And the first thing I did was to use a self-report instrument. So this is very different from the research that I just showed you. And to your question of methodology, here this is using a survey instrument. And I'll talk a little bit more about that survey instrument. It's called the Psychopathic Personality Inventory Revised. And the instrument has 154 questions. And those questions relate to 3 big factors, something called fearless dominance, something else called self-centered impulsivity, and something called cold-heartedness. And there are a set of questions which measure social influence, fearlessness, stress immunity, Machiavellian, ego, blame, rebelliousness, and carefreeness. This is an instrument that was designed by Scott Lilienfeld, another great academic psychologist, really nice guy, sadly passed away last year from cancer about 14 months ago. An amazing guy, prolific researcher. The instrument is regarded as one of the most valid ways of assessing psychopathy in the psychology field. So we were quite comfortable that it's a valid instrument. There are always limitations, but it's a valid instrument. We carried out a study of 2 groups, people who were in procurement and people who were general business executives. And this is just the demographic data. We had 230, 270 in the sample, roughly the same age, similar sort of gender split, slightly different ethnicity, and so forth. We had a total sample of 501. My hypothesis was that supply executives would be more likely to be psychopathic than general business executives. We could not support that hypothesis. This is the data that we found. We found that roughly the same percentage of individuals presented with what one could call clinically supported psychopathy. More importantly, we found 11.9% of executives scored above 65. This is a T-score, which means we have a mean of 50, standard deviation of 10. So they're scoring 1.5 standard deviations above the normal, the mean for the instrument that we used. We found that about 4.5% scored above 2 standard deviations. Now, in clinical diagnosis, you typically use 1.5 standard deviations, and we found 12% scored above that metric. That was significant. This was the distribution. We were extremely surprised and shocked. Obviously, 3 of us have been through the data independently and come up with exactly the same results. We've had students check the data, and we're now conducting a second round of surveys. We've already got over 1,000 respondents using the same instruments. What we found was no difference between purchasing executives and business executives, no statistical difference. Significant elevation of psychopathy in business executives compared to the previous studies of what is called the general population. So that was the first thing. Jeepers, one in 8 executives have some degree of psychopathy, with all of the consequences that we've talked about, that essentially self-serving, egotistical, lack of empathy, possibly very creative and innovative, but some personality difficulties. Second thing we asked was, well, are psychopaths male or female? This is a picture of a lady called Joanna Dennehy, who was imprisoned in the UK for, she's known as the Peterborough ditch murderer, for having 2 guys killed. And she was diagnosed as a psychopath. Long stories about her, but the big debate was, well, aren't all psychopaths male? What we found was that, and again, this is, a lot of statistics, but we found significant differences, slight significant differences. We certainly found that there were more males than females. In other words, the incidence of males scoring above the clinical cutoff for psychopathy was a higher incidence than females, but not a big difference, but what we did find that there were statistically significant differences is that whilst males and females may, be about the same, 1 in 8, 1 in 8.5 are scoring highly for psychopathy, we found it was very, very different. Just to put it bluntly, male psychopaths typically present as sort of the aggressive alpha male. Females who score highly on psychopathy tend to be a little bit more nonconformist. They tend to perhaps not follow the normal expectations, not follow the rules, tend to be a bit more adventurous is the best way of describing it. So bearing in mind that we're looking at executives in supply chain, because everybody's in supply chain, but we certainly found a very high incidence of psychopathy. We're trying to test this because when we've had our papers reviewed in psychology journals, the question is always, can you diagnose with this instrument? Not you can't diagnose, but how can you justify this? So We have to be mindful that we've got to recheck this data with a second survey. But at the moment, and we've been published, about 1 in 8 of executives score in the clinical range for psychopathy. And it's very different between males and females. I think it's fair to say that purchasing executives are no different from other executives, but the big challenge is in that role, you're controlling millions of dollars, even at a university. So I'm leading the strategic procurement development at my university, University of San Diego, with our procurement director. We spend a lot of money. We spend anywhere between, depending on how you measure it, anywhere between 150 million and $300 million a year, if we include capital purchases for new buildings. That's a lot of money. That's a lot of suppliers. They're big contracts. Individuals who place contracts have an inordinate amount of power. There's a lot of fraud in contracting. We haven't formally identified any fraud at my university. I have experience in public and private sector, and in every case I've looked at, there has been fraud. Every organization has fraud. Workplace bullying is problematic, and we know that because we carry out climate surveys in organizations. The final bullet point here is the one that's perhaps the most disconcerting, which is that many organizations fear the reputational damage of exposing somebody who's committed fraud or committed harassment. So in the newspapers, particularly with the Me Too era, organizations have exposed people who have abused others. And that's caused a massive impact on their share price. It's caused massive impact on their reputation. It's caused them major problems as an organization, and quite rightly, so it should. But many organizations sweep this under the carpet. There's a psychologist called Clive Boddy who's published a lot of great work based on his consultancy, and he often reports, when I find a psychopath, somebody who's causing major problems, they don't necessarily get fired. They may get paid off. They may get a big cash incentive to leave. They may get moved to another area, another geography. They may be given, opportunities that wouldn't normally arise. So it's quite disconcerting. I'm not going to talk necessarily about corporations as psychopaths, but there is a view that is that corporations can act as if they are psychopathic. And the final point, this guy, Al Chainsaw Dunlap, he's legendary. He used to go into organizations that were struggling and turn them around. But he was so successful because he was cruel about the way he used to do it. He used to sack people with such joy. He got sent to prison for fraud, by the way. He had a massive ego. He was interviewed by a journalist who was researching psychopathy. And one of the points about psychopaths is they actually don't care that they're psychopaths. One of the interesting things you discover is that individuals who are psychopathic kind of don't care, because that's the trait of being psychopathic. So that's all I wanted to share with you in terms of my formal presentation. I'm mindful we've only got a few minutes left. Either my cycle time and lean management is exceptional, or I was very lucky. I'll leave it up to you to judge. But we've got time for at least one question or comment.
Simon, thank you very much for this very interesting talk. Well, I invite again to everybody that is here, if they want to pose some questions, please just raise your hand or unmute the microphone, or just use the chat window, and we will make those questions arrive to Simon. Simon, do you have time, or you need to run to another thing?
No, I'm fine. I can carry on.
Maybe 10 minutes?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay, so in the meantime, I'm going to ask you some things. It's so interesting. The first thing that I'm curious is the motivation for this pursuit. I know you talk about psychology, but why should we be aware of mapping potential psychopaths in our organizations? Should we be aware that that they are dangerous or something like that? Is this kind of the motivation?
Okay, well, my motivation was from the very simple fact that almost from when I started in business, you realize that relationships are important. And then in my doctoral research, which was looking at innovation in supply chains, one of the key factors was how you develop capabilities as a consequence of relationships. So then if individuals who are party to relationships are toxic, that gets in the way of innovation and strategic success. Now, in our organizations, from a personal point of view, I say to undergraduate students, keep a journal. Keep a journal because you've not worked before. There are many things that are new to you when you go into the workplace, including the fact that not everybody is like you. Not everybody is there for, to support others. Quite often, particularly people who score highly on psychopathy, are there to do what is right for them, to get the advantage for them at your cost. So it's kind of like a defense mechanism. That's one thing. I think organizations have a responsibility, particularly when appointing senior executives, is that they need to be aware of the role that personality can play. We know, for example, that one of the worst ways of assessing an individual for a job is to interview them. So, I've been through psychological assessments. I went for a job interview with Ford when I was 30, and I spent 2 days on psychological assessments alongside every other graduate student, 150 people. And that's the only time. I mean, I've had 5 academic jobs. It's always been by interview, sometimes 40-minute interview, and that's it. You go, well, how do you judge whether I'm competent? How do you judge my personality? And every recruitment decision we take is potentially $1 million investment. So I think it's important for organizations because it impacts everything they do. Daniela has a question. Can corporate compliance programs impact the behavior of corporate psychopaths? I think reflecting on the role that psychopaths adopt to try and categorize individuals, certainly like the police, if a compliance program is there to ensure that people are monitored, yes, they can have a big effect. My experience of compliance programs is that sometimes they're not there to keep check, they're there to try and just show that we have checks. In other words, it's a bit like having a speed limit on the freeway. Are we actually enforcing it, or do we have a speed limit and say, well, that's as much as we need to do? Did you have any other aspects, Daniela, that were kind of behind that question?
No, thank you, Professor. I'm good with that answer.
Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. I have here a small comment of Diana. It's not a question, it's just a comment. I think she's wrapping some of the initial reflections that we are sharing. Thank you very much, Simon. This is very interesting. I think that many of us have evidenced it. My guess is that she's talking about perhaps experiences, personal experiences, but we did not have a clear concept. I do have another other couple of inquiries until we get more of our colleagues here inspired to ask you. Well, you did talk about corruption. So I was wondering if due to this very ego-centered personality that psychopaths tend to have, do you think that they are more susceptible to corruption, or there may be a correlation between psychopath behavior and corruption within organizations?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's one of one of the reasons for studying it. Now, have we got strong evidence in terms of data? We've got strong case evidence. There is clearly from the unsuccessful individuals who commit fraud and corruption, i.e. those who get imprisoned, they are psychologically assessed, and you find 25%, 15 to 25% score as psychopaths. So we know that there's a strong correlation between criminality. But I think it's worth recognizing as well that individuals who score high for psychopathy can be extremely successful, extremely successful. Some of the biggest mass murderers on the planet, clearly psychopaths. Some of the most influential people on the planet scored extremely highly for psychopathy. They just manifest it slightly differently. Rather than killing people, they just say, here's what I'm doing. Elon Musk, I wouldn't say that he's a psychopath, but he has many traits of somebody who basically has got a vision. Here's what I'm doing, and I'm going to do it regardless of what anybody else thinks, because I actually don't care what anybody else thinks. So, you know, this issue of the successful psychopath, I think, is an important stream. Either way, you need to be aware. You need to, you know, it's like playing with fire. You need to know whether it's going to warm you or burn you. And I think with psychopaths, it's the same. Are they going to warm you, or are they going to burn you?
Indeed, Elon Musk, apparently he has some level of Asperger. It's not, of course, not psychopathy, but he does have some. He's a person with certain particular conditions that may allow him to be perhaps very focused on his thing and very successful indeed.
Well, let me just take up that, Felipe,
yes,
that point about autism and psychopathy, which is an area I'm interested in. I'm currently doing a lot more research on and work on autism. Many of the similar characteristics overlap. So you'll find that, you know, people who are psychopathic and people who are autistic have very similar overlap. Compulsive personality disorder is one. Lack of empathy, social affect. You know, if you are familiar with people who have autism, they cannot read social cues very easily. So, you know, for example, I've got relatives who you have to explain feelings. They cannot read it. And they also don't understand it. They don't understand the language of emotions. Psychopaths understand the language of emotions, but they don't care. But to you and I, it looks like it's the same thing, but it manifests itself very differently. So I think that's why Elon Musk is interesting, because he has some aspects of autism by his own definition and own admission, I should say, but he also has some aspects that seem to verge into psychopathy. There's a really great psychologist called Simon Baron-Cohen. He's actually the cousin of Sacha Baron Cohen, the guy who plays Borat analogy. Okay, but he's a world famous expert on autism and has written about creativity a lot and psychopathy. And, you know, he makes the point that it's a subtle difference. So for you and I, although I have a, you know, psychology background, I'm not an expert in assessment. So I wouldn't like to say, well, this person's psychopathic, this person's autistic. I would know how to measure it, but I couldn't sort of sense it straight away. And the danger is the minute you start hearing about psychopaths, you think, God, I know somebody, I know two people, my boss, my dean. Well, I shouldn't say that, but, you know, I've certainly worked with colleagues at other universities who've told me about their dean's behavior, and you have to discuss whether it's something that you need to be concerned about.
Definitely. Simon, one of, perhaps already to wrap it, one of the messages that I'm taking from this talk is that indeed psychopaths, they can be very successful, and we have many examples, for example, on serial killers. They end up being very successful on doing their thing and hiding and so on. So I can imagine that a psychopathic profile, managing a company or many resources can be very successful because, for example, they tend not to care with humanity. So that makes them very efficient. And so I guess that we may arrive to a challenge where the people that work with this person may feel bad or may feel negatively affected as employees, but the organization may be very satisfied with this person because this person is getting where the company wants. So where will we find the balance, or how can we get to the balance? Because in my opinion, psychopaths will be on demand by big organizations if they are so successful.
I tend to agree wholeheartedly with you. That's a really good observation. I think many organizations structure their reward mechanisms to reward people who are psychopathic. And not to make a sweeping judgment, but when I look at employment conditions in the United States compared to, say, the United Kingdom, where there are far fewer protections in the United States, individuals can be basically dismissed at will, whereas you can't do that in the UK or in Europe, where the reward mechanisms and promotion are really focused on acknowledging that some of the behaviors you want to reward are behaviors that are exactly what psychopaths would manifest. So one of my colleagues, Nathan Brooks, who co-authored a lot of this work with me, he was on TV being interviewed by a major news channel in Australia, and at the end the interviewer said, well, organizations are rewarding this sort of behavior. Yes, they are. What should we do? And he said, we should mandate psychological assessment of every executive and then identify who the psychopaths are. And then you go, hang on a minute, can't do that in America because you can't label somebody as a psychopath, because then you've got hundreds of $millions of lawsuits. But the point he was making is you need to know. And I think that's your point. You need to know. I'm going to have to go because I've got a midday off-campus meeting. But
Simon, thank you very much. Very interesting talk. I take a lot of insights from this talk, and especially humanistic ones. I think we need to be careful with everything and everybody surrounding us. And I wish you the greatest afternoon in San Diego, and I hope to see you soon. Enjoy the summer school. Thank you, everybody, for being here.
Thank you, Felipe. Thank you, everybody.
Cheers. Bye.
Goodbye.